Thank you for being here today. We have two items on today's agenda. One is the African American Affairs Board. The other is the rezoning Z5320. Let me ask, who in the audience is here to speak on the African American Affairs Board? No, meaning from the public. Okay. All right. Well, then we will let staff begin their presentation. This is a continuation from a meeting that we had a month ago. So continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Audrey Caesar with Equity and Inclusion. Just wait for the presentation to come up here. Great. So today is a continuation of the African American Affairs Board discussion. And at the last Safe, Vibrant, Healthy Committee meeting, Council requested 4 items. 1 was a rationale for a standalone board. 2 was a structure comparison of the newly created boards, and a plan to move forward was requested, as well as what the cost would be for staffing. So the first piece I want to start with is the rationale for the standalone board. While we have several boards that serve a variety of different groups, the very foundation that this country has been founded in has its basis in race. And the African American experience has been different from any other group. African Americans have had struggles that have led to disparities. So if we look at any measure of success around income, education, health, criminal justice, significant disparities exist for African Americans, even greater than other groups. If we look back in the history, we recognize that the immigration status of African Americans is different because they were the only group that did not willingly choose to come to the United States of America. The board, being specific to African Americans, would provide an exclusive focus that will ensure that Black voices are heard and that some of the issues can be carried forward in totality. So if we look at other boards, there are other directions, other focuses, but really having a focus on the African American experience is critical. And so that's the rationale for the board. If we look at the other boards that we have recently pulled together, meaning the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board, also the Police Advisory Board, we can see that the structures are a little bit different. For the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board, we have 15 members, and we really wanted a delineation between professional and community so that we can have representation from folks who serve the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs community, meaning professional, and then folks who are community advocates. We have a professional chair, a community chair, and secretary. So that's the breakdown in terms of the leadership. For the Police Advisory Board, we ended up with 9 members. This board was different because we actually specified the type of positions that we wanted. So we had a civil rights attorney, a representative from the LGBTQ community, a mental health provider, a victims advocate, and then 2 at-large members of the board. The leadership structure is similar to the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board. You have a chair, you have a vice chair, and then a secretary. What has been proposed for the African American Affairs Board looks slightly different. Also 9 members, but very specific roles. So a youth advocate, community liaison, environmentalist, a civil rights attorney, a physician, human services professionals, an economist, and historian. So these are very specific types of roles. And so as we consider this board and as we think about how it would function, another thing to consider is the possibility of maybe not having so many, but having at-large positions where these roles could fill. As we look at backfilling positions and alternates, it's really difficult to target specific positions. So having the at-large flexibility will allow us to have all of this representation, but maybe not with the specific named position.
Can I ask a question before we go further?
Yes.
The the proposed board, that came from the two advocates who spoke. Did you do any research to see what other groups had done and how their boards might be structured?
Absolutely. So we've got an African American Affairs Board in neighboring Durham, and they have some seats that are similar to these, but they don't contain all of these seats. For example, community advocate, civil rights attorney, liaison, those are standard. So that's why I make the recommendation of possibly having an at-large seat or several at-large seats, so that it's not necessarily that we have to fill all of these, but we'll have representation in some form or fashion. Now, in terms of other boards around the state, I don't really know that other cities have them. I want to say Greensboro does, but I need to check on that for sure. But we've seen African American Affairs boards across the country, and with those boards, they're mostly community advocates and folks declared as professional. So they work somewhere in the field of human services, or they're a historian or professors, folks who are really dedicated to this particular cause. The proposed African American Affairs Board membership did come from community members. This is what they were recommending. But in terms of how we choose to structure it, I think it's really about the goals and objectives and how we frame up the board, and that will really determine the type of seats that we need. It's very difficult to compare city to city because it's like apples and oranges. I think the needs are different between cities. So I hope that answers your question in terms of what we need. Okay, thank you. Staffing needs. So the Equity Inclusion Office would require a dedicated position for this board. And after working with our budget department, the total cost for salary and benefits would be anywhere from $87,000 to $90,000, and that includes salary, benefits, training, and just the initial startup costs for the position. So again, this is just going back to the last presentation in terms of how we would structure the board and how we would set it up. So we are in this pre-formation phase where we're really just trying to see if this is going to be a good fit for Raleigh, and just really trying to understand all the ins and outs of what the board would entail. From there, we would move to a council vote, ordinance, board development. So this is what board development looks like. There would be an orientation, a selection process, election of leadership, bylaws development, and then work plan development. This process takes about 9 to 10 months in totality, just because once we get folks involved and engaged, we have to educate them on what are the policies and procedures of the city and how boards and commissions operate. So proposed next steps, should council decide to move forward with this, we would need to finalize a proposal. So that means selecting a framework to make sure that we shore up the purpose and the mission and types of seats. Then we would need to solicit membership. It's important to decide on an application process or counselor selection through the interest forms, which we've done for other boards and commissions, and then identify the terms. How long will individuals serve? Typically, for boards and commissions, a term consists of 2 years, repeatable of 3 terms. So as we move into questions and discussions, I also want to follow up on our conversation on Human Relations Commission, which was last month as well. Over the past 2 years, the Human Relations Commission has gone through significant change in terms of the structure, in terms of how we're set up, and the work that we're doing. You know, the mission is to promote human dignity and harmony, and we've really taken some strides to be more inclusive. In the past, the Human Relations Commission didn't really engage the community as much, and some of our outreach was limited. Now we have taken a stance where we not just engage the community, but we include the community in terms of how we approach different ideas, programs, and support services. Council gave this group the amazing opportunity of looking at African American affairs in Raleigh, and particularly the history. So we've been working on a project related to street renaming. So as we get those requests, we're creating that process. The board has expanded to include youth representation. So in the bylaws, it has always stated that youth should be engaged and a part of this conversation. So we actually did that back when we incorporated our new application process that I think you all were part of in August. Additionally, for those who weren't there in the 2019 presentation when we rolled out the assessment, we looked at ways of being effective, and the first thing we wanted to do was to create a video. So right there, we created a video with community members telling us what was equity and how they believed it, and we actually shared that with council. So we've made great strides with the Human Relations Commission in terms of not really being super active to now being very proactive. This past weekend, we were at Juneteenth celebrating in 2 locations, at the Pope House and also at the Slave Narrative Readings at Chavis. I think the idea of the Human Relations Commission is to really be a place for everybody, for all groups, and to support human dignity and human rights. And so I think we're actually moving the needle related to that now. Whereas in the past, we really didn't support a lot of the different projects. We held a banquet and we did some awards, and it was very limited outreach. So the reason why I share that is because I wanted to follow up and just to make sure that you all understood that the Human Relations Commission is making just some amazing progress. And we held our application process for the first time back in August of 2020. And I think that really helped us define the positions and the roles and getting the right people in the seats. So at that point, we really replaced 7 individuals with that process. So we've got people who are really interested in making Raleigh a great city, and they're really interested in communing with their community partners and also residents in terms of what we need to do. So they're really engaged and have their ears to the streets in terms of the work. So I did want to share that piece as well.
When you we just filled 2 openings on the Human Relations Commission, improving that diversity. So, in the past when I was on council, the HRC tended to be more about events and was not actively engaged in providing guidance. And I think that that's the transition that needs to be made. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we've done any, again, research with some of our peer cities on what their Human Relations Commission boards look like and what they do, but that could prove beneficial as well.
Yeah, so in terms of our peer cities, we're on par with Charlotte and Winston-Salem and Durham in terms of human relations. The biggest difference between us and other departments is fair housing. So fair housing falls up underneath HRC for the vast majority of our peer cities. But in the state, we have a statewide network, so we have a benefit of having these conversations about where we're going. And most of the HRCs across the state are making the move towards equity. So they're focusing on equity and inclusion, they're focusing on education and training, and providing those options for community members.
Okay. Do we have any questions, Councilor Fort?
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Caesar. I have one question. You indicated the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board was recently created and it has 15 members. I was wondering, and I may have missed it, why is there just 9 members proposed for the African American Affairs Board?
So the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board was created by council. So council actually gave the recommendation on the number of seats that we had. And again, we wanted to have this emphasis on the professional environment as well as community members. So that's why it's a larger board, because we clearly wanted that representation there. So in terms of the African American Affairs Board, this was proposed by community members, and I feel like council has the flexibility to really decide what that size would look like should you all decide to move forward with this.
Could you go back to the slide?
Sure.
One thing that I think is missing is just the number of community members. To have one community liaison, I think really limits who from certain organizations could be included. So maybe potentially increasing that number for community.
Okay.
And then if you could go back to your opening slide, I believe, Dr. Caesar. Forward. The part about the mission,
The mission.
purpose. Yes, okay, that one. So the proposed next steps, then, when you say select a framework, what does that mean?
So the framework is really guiding the board in terms of what their functions will be. So is this going to be an advisory framework? Is this going to be a policy board? We need to really figure out what the aim is. And the framework is more or less who's on the board, who contributes to the board, and how the board sits in terms of city government, where it sits. Most of the boards and commissions under equity inclusion are independent boards, but there's a possibility that this board could be linked to several other boards. We've initiated this collaborative effort between all of our boards recently, and that's been something new since we've had the Office of Equity Inclusion, is to increase collective impact where these boards work together and have unified goals and objectives. So that's what we mean by framework. It's how we're structured, who sits on the board, and what is the purpose and mission of the board.
Okay. Does anybody have any feedback on that? Councilor Buffkin?
Question, thank you. So Dr. Caesar, I want to talk a little more about staffing. Was I understanding correctly you'd have one position dedicated to supporting the board?
That's correct.
And that's that person's only job?
Well, no. So
Okay,
the way we're set up now, and there's as it stands today, there are 4 of us, and we're supporting 7 boards. In addition, we also manage the DEI efforts for the entire city. So this person would have board responsibilities as a staff liaison. They would also have internal responsibilities working with the DEI efforts.
Okay, so that's more, I mean, that's very typical in the city structure. Yeah. At least my experience with boards is, people who support board work also do lots of other things. Yes. And so we would use the same model here?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any comments on framework?
I do.
Councilor Cox?
I was wondering with the Hispanic board if we could get copies of their mission and vision statement and any details about their we understand their framework in terms of the types of people that are on the board, but it would be good idea to get maybe a clearer idea of their purpose and mission and what it is that they're working on, and then we can use that to think about the African American Affairs Board as well.
Absolutely. So the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board has a webpage. And so on the webpage, we do have their mission, vision, and work plan that I think they presented to you all back. It's been a few months at this point, probably February they presented. They're currently working on a community engagement event around COVID to allow more of our Hispanic and Latino community members to get vaccinated because we know that the rates are extremely low. So we're partnering with a variety of organizations, El Centro Hispano being one of those, to pull off this event. So that's what they're working on right now. And just off the top, their mission is really to close the gaps as it relates to civic participation and understanding the relationship, increasing accessibility for individuals who might have limited English proficiency. So those are some of the goals. So it's civic pursuits, it's language, and it's also engagement.
Okay, and are there specific African American organizations that you have reached out to get their input about the formation of an African American Affairs Board regarding the purpose and mission specifically?
Not at this time, but I think that goes into the proposed next steps. Definitely identifying those organizations and reaching out to them and understanding what that impact could be to work together and collaborate on coming up with something like that.
Okay. Okay. So that would require a council action to authorize you to make those next steps, I take it.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I think it would be helpful if you brought back a framework that is advisory, similar to what
Okay.
the Hispanic Affairs and Immigrant Affairs Board is structured. I'd like to see, based on that, the purpose, mission, and types of seats. You know, you have input from the community, but I think Councilor Cox actually brings up a good point. You might want to reach out to some of the community organizations to get feedback on what that structure might look like. And I think the application process has worked very well so far. We've created a new police advisory board, a new Hispanic Immigrant Affairs Board. We've used an application process with then counselor selection. I think that really opens it up to the community. You might get people involved who might otherwise not be involved. So that would be the direction I would head in, and I would look for some concurrence if that was the case with other council members. Councilmember Cox is saying yes. Councilmember Buffkin?
On the question of how the applications are received?
No, on the framework. Advisory in nature, come back with a purpose, mission, type of seats, define that, and then application process, and then we would have to identify terms.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with going ahead that way. Is that what the folks who brought this up were asking for?
They're not here to answer that question, so, but that's the framework we've used for the Hispanic and Immigrant Affairs Board. Councilor Fort?
I agree.
Okay. Do you need any further direction, Dr. Caesar?
No, I have the direction, and so I'm assuming this would be at the next meeting. We'd bring-
Yes,
Okay.
and the other thing I would like you to include is just a plan for budgeting,
Okay.
where the funding come from.
Okay. Will do.
Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, next we have rezoning Z5320. Is the applicant here for that? Normally how I start committee meetings is I will ask the applicant to come up and give a presentation, kind of like take us through where we were, where we are. And then I will also set aside some time for members of the public to speak. And then we can raise questions through a show of hands. Okay?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the committee. I'm Jamie Schwadler with Parker, Poe, Adams, and Bernstein at 301 Fayetteville Street here in Raleigh. I'm happy to represent the applicant here today. With me is Mr. Avi Grawal, along with his sister Sunny and other representatives of the Singh Development Company. We also have our entire development team here with representatives from Stewart and Ramey Kemp. And we're also joined by 4 members of the Curran family whose land is subject to this zoning request here with us in the middle row.
Could we just have a show of hands, like you're naming people, but I have no idea who anybody is.
Sure. Will anyone associated with the proponents of this case please raise your hand? Yes. Thank you. I will, following the lead of the mayor, I will go through where we were in this case when this case was being prepared to be filed, and then Mr. Gawal will go through the decision-making process that led to the changes in conditions as the case progressed, because this case was filed in the midst of COVID and included an assisted living component where the mechanics and the realities of assisted living changed dramatically during the course of the case, as did many things around the country. And so we were making those decisions in real time and having those conversations in the neighborhood meetings and with council members. And I think some of that story helps to explain where we started and where we were. So these are the conditions that were part of the case in October of 2020 when we had our first required pre-application neighborhood meeting. The uses were limited to residential and accessory uses, multi-unit living, and congregate care. The number of units were for either use or the combination thereof shall be limited to 350 units. And the reason for the mixture is because we were in approximately 5 months of COVID at this time, it was unclear what the future of congregate care would be. There was a hope that there would be a mixture for one product to offset the cost of another, but we were uncertain about how that would shake out over the course of the case. And based on that initial neighborhood meeting, we heard kind of concerns that fell into 4 major concern topics. Now, of course, there were many concerns raised. I'm going to just try to summarize what we heard kind of the majority of folks have concerns about. And that was the height of what the buildings would be, because our request was proposed to be an RX7, so mixed residential use, limited to 7 stories. Concerns over buffers to the north and the west of the site. Concerns about building setback, the distance from the northern property line primarily, and then concerns about traffic and density. And I'll mix those together because of this area on Lead Mine Road. There's an existing traffic pattern that folks were concerned about, and the number of homes that could be added here contributed to concerns not only about density but about traffic. So those two were mixed to an extent. After going through the application process and receiving feedback from staff about how we could make this case more consistent with the comprehensive plan and respond to the neighbors' requests, we made a series of changes and presented them. We submitted them October 26th with the application, and then made changes based on that first neighborhood meeting, and held a second neighborhood meeting January 11th. So in that case, we limited the principal uses to multi-unit living and congregate care and accessory uses. We also included some ancillary services because we heard a desire to have some sort of ground floor activation from the neighbors, and included that in the request. And then we had the mixture of the multi-unit and congregate care, and also presented the concept plan that neighbors had requested to illustrate what the code required in terms of buffers that would be required for a mixed-use residential designation that's adjacent to R4, R6, R10 zoning. So we illustrated that in the concept plan above, and then we shared these sections that are below to show how a possible building would be configured on the site. Now, at this time in January, we didn't have a design for the building. We hadn't done all the grading and necessary items, as one typically doesn't in a rezoning case, to know exactly where the building would be. And at the same time, the city was going through changes on how they measured height. And we explained at that first neighborhood meeting and subsequent conversations that we filed for the RX7 because although we hoped to have a building that would appear to be somewhere around 4.5, possibly 5 feet in appearance, it would also have most likely 2 floors of structured parking to support that many units on the site. And the city at the time was going through, as you all are probably aware, through years of changing how height was measured. And so if we thought we were going to end up somewhere that would look sort of like a 5-story building, if you added structured parking, that could kick you up into another category. If you're above a 5-story designation, you're automatically kicked into the 7. So we started with the 7, and we're working with staff to try to determine how that height would be measured as we went. Following that second neighborhood meeting, we had continued discussions with Councilmember Buffkin as well as the residents in this area, and based on those conversations, made some significant changes that again went to those four principal issues that were raised. So you'll see those changes on the screen. These were submitted in January and presented at the February 23rd Planning Commission, where it was made clear that we were consistent with the comprehensive plan, and the council and the staff's analysis has been consistent on that point. In the changes that you see on your screen, we had limited the gross floor area of the ground floor use to 3,000 square feet. We still were at 350 units because we were trying to respond to the need for housing in this area. But we added a 50-foot principal building setback along the northern property line, and we added a Type B protective yard with a minimum width of 30 feet along the northern property line, abutting those properties in the same location. And that's significant because we're up against, the northern property line is up against a PD. So the UDO does not require the same significant transitional protective yards as it does when you're up against a R10 or an R6 or an R4. And so that offer of the 30-foot buffer was above the code and in response to concerns we'd heard from the neighbors. In addition, the 50-foot principal setback is above and beyond what the code would require in that situation. And we explained at that point on the Inman Park side of the northern property line, those folks already have a 30-foot protective buffer on the north side of their property. It has nothing to do with our rezoning case. That's there for them. It's in their neighborhood. So that what we were doing is in addition on our south side. And we also limited the buildings to no more than 6 stories as measured above the average finished grade on the facade of the building facing Lead Mine Road. The reason we did that is that we were trying to respond to the concerns in height, but we're still uncertain about how the city would measure the final finished height of the building. At the March 23rd Planning Commission and preparing to go to the May 4th City Council meeting, we submitted additional conditions in response to neighbors' concerns. Condition number 5 was that in addition to the 30-foot buffer that we're adding along the northern property line, could we preserve some of those trees in that area? And we explained that because the city code has certain requirements of how you count tree conservation area, and in zoning requests, you can't guarantee, you can't bind the city's hands where that will be, but you can evaluate where that will be. And so we committed to evaluate that along the northern property line. We also increased that minimum width to 32 feet because that's the minimum width of the primary tree conservation area, study area. And so we thought that those two would align nicely. If it did not qualify for primary tree conservation area, we agreed to plant above and beyond the code requirement, again, and detailing what that Type B protective yard should include at a minimum. We also increased the runoff limitation for stormwater 25-year storm above the 2 and 10-year storm. We also committed to the highest level of a neighborhood transition yard on the eastern property line, which is 50 feet, a Zone A Type 3 protective yard. With that maximum 50 feet, because we heard some of those concerns along the eastern property line. Now, the eastern property line adjoins the Curran's property. It's the property that before you on the May 4th hearing, they testified they would like to remain and live out their years. So there's no immediate plans to develop that property. That's not part of the zoning case. There aren't folks that live there that are complaining about this. Those folks are the Curran's. The neighbors that had asked for that additional protective yard, as they explained it to us, were concerned about what their views might be like, possibly from Philcrest or from Inman Park, or what the future development of that parcel could be. So in order kind of to protect what the future development could be, but not existing neighbors living on the eastern property line. On the northern property line, there are existing neighbors on there, and we've spoken with many of them and met in their backyards. In addition to some of those conditions that were, or concerns that were raised, we also added parking and pedestrian lighting limitations and screening to the parking garage, or any potential parking garage, to ensure that any kind of light or noise or intrusion from the parking garage would be screened in the way that the city has become accustomed to adding those limitations. All of this was offered before the March 23rd Planning Commission and received a positive vote to move the case forward, which brought us to the May 4th City Council meeting. And shortly before that meeting, we learned that there was still opposition to the case. We'd been in touch with a core stakeholder group that represented folks from Inman Park as well as further down Philcrest Drive, and a good cross-representation, I think, of all of those folks' interests. And we've been trying to kind of balance all of those requests and respond to them, but learned that there was still opposition to the case, and that most of those concerns, again, related to density or intensity on the site. And so so just before the May 4th hearing, we couldn't change the conditions officially because they'd gone forward to the council, but we did offer and spoke at the hearing to remove the multi-unit living and reduce this just to congregate care, and then to limit the height of any portion of a building along the northern property line for the first 100 feet to 3 stories. And we thought that was significant because it goes directly to, first of all, the setback and the distance from the existing neighbors on the northern property line, but also by limiting to congregate care, we drastically reduce our traffic counts. And so hearing that both the density and the intensity were something that was concerned, we removed the multi-unit living possibility and restricted it all to assisted living. Following that May 4th public hearing, we didn't receive substantive comments, I don't believe, from council instructing us on the specifics of the conditions, but we were asked to meet with the neighbors, and so we did that. Within the next week, we were out on site in Mr. Pryor Gibson's backyard with that same stakeholder group and many representatives from the Sing Development. At that time, we shared, you can see the prior concept plan on the screen, which was relatively that kind of bubble concept, and now that we reduced it to the congregate care, we went back to the drawing board and actually came up with a potential plan. Again, this is conceptual. This is not an engineered building that's had all of its stormwater and grading done, but it's for purposes of the zoning case, and presented it to the neighbors, pulled together within about a week to get all of those new conditions kind of into what a conceptual plan could look like. And that's what you see on the top left of your screen. So the concept plan was just the building bubble envelope. The more kind of illustrative of what it could actually be is there on the top left. We also shared perspectives that we generated over the weekend and throughout that week, trying to estimate for folks standing in the yards of the folks who are on that stakeholder committee that have worried about their views, have worried about what it would look like, trying to generate a picture for them at this height that we've committed to reducing to. And one thing I should have mentioned that I was very remiss in not mentioning is at the Planning Commission, we did drop the case from 7 stories to 4. And that was in direct result of one of the main complaints that we'd heard throughout the case from the neighbors of what will the height be. We continued those conversations of how we believe the city would measure that height. Staff did a tremendous amount of work in trying to answer many of those questions. But when we did that, we really believed that by dropping that down, it was a show of good faith of trying to say we're taking a little bit of the risk here because we're still not sure exactly how these buildings will be laid out, but we're limiting ourselves to 4 stories and taking that forward to council. So moving back to the May 4th on-site neighborhood meeting, we tried to illustrate what those restrictions now would mean. We're not talking about the potential of 5 stories or 6 stories. We're talking about a limit of 4 stories under the code. And here were the perspectives of how that might look and play out. Following the May 14th site visit, we did receive some additional requests from the stakeholder group. We traded many emails back and forth. We copied Councilmember Rufkin on all of our responses so that there was transparency in terms of what we offered and what we were not able to do. And in response to those requests, and we weren't able to meet all of them, but we did make some additional significant moves. And that was reducing the number of congregate care units down from 250 down to 185. To increasing or being more specific about the type B protective yard on the northern property line and coming up with minimums of what those replacement plantings would be in the event we weren't able to satisfy protective or a tree conservation area. And then we also agreed to a new conservation area, study area on 50 feet within the eastern property line that we would also evaluate those trees for tree conservation area. Again, in response to requests from the neighbors that eastern property line that is not bordered by the existing owners that also are subject to this request. It's not bordered by existing families, but we did agree to study that area and preserve that area for 50 feet of tree conservation area if it was evaluated and satisfied the UDO standards. If not, we still committed to that type 3 50-foot yard. We also indicated a further restriction on area lighting for within 150 feet of the northern and eastern property lines instead of 100 feet. We limited ourselves in terms of location for trash and storage to not within 200 feet of the northern property line, again in response to questions from the neighbors. We also agreed to screen trash collection, mechanical equipment, and other utilitarian equipment with components that complemented the design of the building through similar look and aesthetics, again, in response to the requests from the neighbors. With that response back, so that went back to the neighbors, I believe, on May 24th, because we needed to finalize our presentation to be back before you all on the June 1st hearing. And with those new conditions, we also, again, generated a new concept plan to illustrate them. The star that you see on the screen is Mr. Pryor Gibson's house, who's been part of the stakeholder group. As you see, the majority of the northern property line is adjacent to his backyard. That's the backyard that we met in the day that we had the site visit, and the pictures I showed you on your screen at the June 1st hearing. And then we updated the rendering so that you could see from the east what that new 50-foot, what the 50-foot transition yard would look like, and what the view from the east would be, comparing the May 3rd renderings to the new May 24th renderings once you take into account the tree conservation study area and the additional commitments. We also provided the renderings from the north. Again, the top of your screen shows the May 3rd rendering that we shared, and then the bottom is the May 24th with that increased commitment on the northern property line. On the right side of your screen, on the left side of your screen, you'll see the pictures of standing in Mr. Gibson's backyard and the significant existing tree cover that exists, both within some of that property and then, of course, on our property line. The bottom picture on the left is part of that property on our property side that we would be evaluating for the tree conservation area. So we're going from the northern property line and then now to the northwest. Again, this is the area looking from the northwest, kind of in the top left of your area, looking back towards Lead Mine Road. And as you can see, once we've dropped that height restriction, not only to the 4 stories, but now a limitation of within 150 feet of that northern property line is even further limited by no buildings at all. You significantly reduce any impact that the neighbors would have in terms of a view corridor. And now, and I think it's fair to say that the neighbors feel that there's an impact with this rezoning case, and I think it's also fair to say that that's true with almost any zoning case that you have. I'm not here to say that we've solved all of the concerns that they've had, but I do hope that illustrating what we've done from the beginning of this case to today illustrates the good faith efforts that we've made to meet with the neighbors, to listen to them. It might not have been as often as they wanted. It might not have been changing as many things as they wanted, but we've followed the process and we've done as many things as we can, often changing the project itself multiple times. It's significantly reduced. It's a much lower density. It's a completely different project than what we started with. And that's by design. We did that because we were trying to deliver a project that this council could feel was a worthy compromise, and both sides leave not getting everything that they might have wanted or believe that should happen at the outset, but can leave with reliable housing for our seniors in an area that's prime for development. And we hope that that's evident to you today. I'm happy to answer any further questions about that, but I did want to give Mr. Gall a time to explain how those changes were made from a business perspective over the course of that time.
Thanks, Jamie.
If we could just have your name and address for the record.
Oh,
Thank
sure.
you.
Avi Graywall with Sing Development and Waltonwood Senior Living, 2601 Weston Parkway, Suite 203, Cary, North Carolina. So I think Jamie just did a good job of explaining kind of a little bit at the beginning of our presentation about, kind of as a business, our thought process through the last year, but I just wanted to dig a little deeper into that. So Sing Development and Waltonwood Senior Living is pretty much, it's the same company. We're a family owned and operated business. We just celebrated our 48th year anniversary, and we've been doing senior housing for the last 30 plus years. Our business model focuses on, zero outside equity partners. It's all, family. It was a family run business. We have 1,200 plus employees. And our model is to build and hold properties for the long term. We don't sell anything. We build. So we're very specific about the communities we develop in, and very specific about the locations we develop in, especially when it comes to senior housing. And so on this property here, and just to step back real quick, the most recent senior community we developed was Waltonwood Lake Boone off Lake Boone Trail, just down the street from Rex Hospital inside the Beltline. And so we're pretty, that community was our first in Raleigh, and we're surprised at the reception we received. We knew there was a demand for senior housing, and we were shocked at how much demand there was. And so when we first spoke to Mr. Kern about this property, and with him and his neighbors, we always thought that this would be great for that demand for senior housing. And that was back in February of 2020. And as we all know, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit. So we still felt that there was a strong demand for senior housing, but we didn't know what the future was. We had shut down all leasing in our communities. We've limited all our visitors, and just kind of we stepped back and said, okay, what's the future of senior here, and what do seniors really want? And so we're Waltonwood Lake Boone. We have 182 units. It's independent living, assisted living, and memory care. It's kind of a traditional model of senior housing here. We thought that maybe seniors will want to be living in a more active adult community, and we provide services from the outside. Maybe that's just an assisted living community, with 90 or 150 units, and then there could be a multifamily component next to it that's targeted for seniors, and they could have the services delivered from the assisted living community. So it's been, it's just been a year of just trying to figure these things out. And to coincide with that, we've been trying to work with Jamie and our engineers and the neighbors, trying to figure out, what the constraints of the site were. And so, kind of we're, after all of that and meeting with the neighbors and trying to, make everybody happy, we've kind of landed on this 185 unit plan, and it'll just be an assisted living community most likely. Maybe we'll offer some independent living units. But what we found, as we've come out of the pandemic here, is that there is such a strong demand for senior housing still. And we're seeing that, and we're proud to say that, in our communities, we had very few cases, and when we did have cases, we got under control pretty quickly. And so the demand is still there, and the demand is even more so for communities like ours that we're not a big conglomerate where we have thousands and thousands of units of senior living units throughout the country. We have 12 communities, and we're very focused on the communities that we're in. And so we just feel like the demand is still there, and we think that this is a great spot for it. So I'm here to answer any questions.
Okay. Do we have any questions of either speaker? Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else from the proponent side who would like to speak? Okay. Anybody from the neighborhood who is here who would like to speak in opposition? Going once?
Sorry, I wasn't prepared to speak today. Hi, I'm gonna have to take off my glasses, y'all. I'm Angie Brandt. I'm at 1900 Russell Drive. Again, I'm not prepared to speak. I don't have a presentation for you all. I did drive in on Sunday night at 11:30 at night after a long day of rain. I took a video of Fillcrest Drive, which is my concern. It's the concern of all my neighbors. It has been our concern. The views are not our concern. This is about safety. It is about the quality of Fillcrest Road, which is a county road. Where else in Raleigh, so close to thousands and thousands and thousands of commuters a day, do you have almost 20 acres of county land with a tiny 15.5-foot county road that would be utilized not only for construction access, but for high density development, and will further degrade a road that has no shoulders, it has no sidewalks. It is not safe for us to drive on it as it is. It's not safe for us to walk to get to the transit stop. So that's where our concerns lie as neighbors off of Fillcrest Drive. Those concerns, I know the developer can't fix all of Fieldcrest Drive. I understand that. But our concerns have been completely ignored in regards to that. And when I'm talking about concerns, I'm also saying we asked for improvements to the transit stop, which is a visual barrier. I just today tried to pull out to come here, and I have to stop and then pull out further to be able to see around that transit stop. And in doing so, somebody's coming northbound on Lead Mine Road, and I almost could have hit them, right? So I had to back up. So even asking the developer to just lobby the city just to ask for improvements to that stop every 2 years, it doesn't cost them anything other than a few minutes to make the phone call or do whatever they need to do to ask for that, was denied. We've asked for exit-only right turn from the development on Fieldcrest to avoid cars coming up and down. We already have cut-through traffic because people are trying to avoid all the congestion at North Hills and Lead Mine, Lead Mine and Glenwood. So trying to ask for exit-only where we're gonna limit the amount of traffic on this road that won't be improved, it hasn't happened. So, you know, there's almost 20 acres, and I have lived at this house for 16 years. I love it, driving down that road, but the reality is it should all be developed, and it will be developed. The Currens have an existing lot next door. We, in that neighborhood meeting with the developer, asked if they would be willing to work with the Currens to try to acquire that extra property, to develop more, to have a comprehensive plan, because then it would solve the issue of Fieldcrest, and it would also provide additional housing. So I understand that the Currens don't want to sell and they want to live in that property, you know, until their days are over. But, you know, how many neighbors ask a developer to do more? So the reality is we're not being unreasonable, but the safety of our families, the safety of the people who are going to live in that development, the safety of the people who drive on Lead Mine Road is a concern. A woman wrote you all telling you about a traumatic brain injury that she had just because of a small accident on Lead Mine Road. You know, I'm going to have kids that are going to be driving. I have kids that take the city bus from school, and I won't let them take the bus to that transit stop because that means that they would have to walk on Fieldcrest, and it's not safe. We have neighbors that live down the road on North Hills Drive that utilize that transit stop, and they are in lower income housing. They are going to get their kids, you know, if they're sick from school, or they're going to get groceries, and they're utilizing a stop that doesn't have a bench, it doesn't have covered seating. They're sitting in the rain, they're sitting in fire ant infested property waiting to get on the bus. So that's county property. I understand it's complicated, but there is so much that can be done there. And the Sing development is beautiful. It's lovely. It's not a problem for us to have development. But Fieldcrest Road has been ignored completely. And I get that the developer can't fix the road as a whole, but that's where my neighbors are coming from when asking you to look at this and to see what our concerns are. If you fix this one little section, you're leaving the rest of a donut that is still county property. It's like taking a bite out of a donut in a box and then putting it down and leaving it for somebody else to deal with. So that's just what I've asked of you. I know my neighbors have all written you all with the same concerns. Yes, we are concerned about density. Yes, we're concerned about height. Yes, we're concerned about being too close to neighbors. There is also a single family home immediately south. It's a one-story ranch. Just across from the Currens' home is a 1.5-story house on Fieldcrest. Those neighbors are concerned, and they're not here today, but I am speaking on their behalf. So I just ask that you recognize that this isn't such a simple shut case for us. There's safety that comes much to heart for me and for my neighbors. Okay. And I'd be happy to show you the video if I was able to show you somehow, but.
Anybody else?
Good morning. My name's Kevin Gard. I'm at 1644 Standard Trail.
Could you speak into the microphone,
Sure,
please?
sure. Thank you. I appreciate this time to give you sort of the broader view from the community. We've heard a lot about how this project has developed. There have been a lot of changes, and as Jamie mentioned, the project we have today is very different, and it was due to all of the interaction with the community, our objections and bringing forth those. But there still are issues around the case that haven't been looked at or talked about. And that's because we have the broader view of, as Angie mentioned, we have this 21 acres of land that eventually, not today, but eventually will be developed, and it's in a hole, as she mentioned. And what we would like to see is development in such a way that that whole area, whenever it's fully developed, fits in as a puzzle piece into the Crabtree area. It's not within the Crabtree Growth Center, it's in the residential side on the other side of the street. So we're very sensitive to that. One of the big issues that was mentioned but not addressed in any of the conditions other than reducing the number of units is traffic. The applicant's TIA for this area was very enlightening as the density of traffic. We have the report put out about 30,000 vehicles per day pass by the site. And that's in the AM and that's in the PM. This location is on the eastern side of Lead Mine Road. And so, and also according to this TIA, that most of the visits to the site are coming from the south, from the Crabtree interchange with Blue Ridge Road, Lead Mine Road, and North Hills Drive. So most traffic is coming to the site for visits or for staff coming to work, and then later in the day or at some point they'll be leaving. If 80% of that traffic is leaving and needs to return back to the Glenwood Avenue area, they have to make a left-hand turn across traffic to do that. And we have two possibilities for traffic interaction on Lead Mine Road. That's at Charles Drive, which is an access point inside the Crabtree Growth Center, where there's going to be apartments. There's already some. There's planned for other apartment complexes to be developed on that side of the road. So there'll be direct conflicts in traffic at the main entrance to this site. There, without a light, that's one of our concerns. Second concern that's been brought up is this State Road, Fillcrest Road, which, as things have changed, looks like there's been a reduction in the interaction from this site, but not an elimination of the interaction in this site with Fillcrest Road. And in the future, as things get developed, we'll be, as it is today, stuck with Fillcrest Road as it is or as it gets upgraded. And we have this broader question of, is that the appropriate thing to do? If this whole area was developed, say 21 acres, and it connects to a neighborhood, is Fillcrest Road going to be the right thing to do to connect these neighborhoods and this additional development to Lead Mine Road? We do not have an answer for that question. And if this development goes in, we're going to get locked into whatever we have to do or deal with Fillcrest. And Fillcrest, if you've ever driven it and come up to Lead Mine Road, you would never make a left-hand turn. And that's because the visibility is highly obstructed. I had some slides that illustrate this, but you only have about 150 feet of clear visibility of the traffic coming up from North Hills Drive area approaching Fillcrest at 45 miles an hour. And at best, you have about 250 feet of obstructed visibility due to the trees, telephone poles, the bus stop, and vegetation that's in the way. So, to summarize from my point of view, we want to see good development for this whole area. We don't want to get locked into perhaps a bad situation just because we don't have a design. We haven't looked at this to say, hey, if we develop this whole area with residential, can we get everybody out safely on Fillcrest if we put this development here? And that's what we're left with. So I thank you for this time.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else from the public like to speak?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Prior Gibson, 1724 Wysong, Raleigh, 27603. And apologies to council, I didn't have remarks prepared, but hearing the presentation by Parker Poe, I felt compelled to at least not get into maybe the specifics, but to say some general things. And first off, this has been going on for months and months and months. And to the great credit of both the applicant and certainly to the neighbors, there's never been anything, Madam Mayor, other than the sincere desire to be constructive and to try to find a plan that we could, as neighborhoods, live with and help, in this case, Sing Development, put a development there that we could all live with. I have to say out loud and publicly that Sing Development does a very good project. We did our homework. They're excellent developers. But Madam Mayor and Council, in this case, this is just too much project in a small area. That's the bottom line for those of us that have to deal with the realities. They started off with a 350 unit project on a 5-acre lot in an area that's completely surrounded by our R4 and serviced by a road that you can't even cross when it rains with no stoplight. So at the end of the day, we have a saying where I'm from that sometimes you can't put a gallon of water in a quart jug. And that's what our developer here was trying to do. And to their credit, they made motions the right way. And quite frankly, I think if we'd have had an honest, open, genuine conversation 7 or 8 months ago, we could have come up with a plan that we could have all lived with. But this has not been a good process. As a developer, as a general contractor now for 40 years, as the drafter of most of the statutes in North Carolina on development, this process has not been what the upzoning statutes intended it to be. It was intended to be a tool for the folks on this council to be able to listen constructively to the neighborhoods and applicants and do the right thing. And this hasn't happened in this case. So I would urge you, Raleigh's got too many wonderful things happening to it, and we're all proud to be members of this community. But it's time to kind of look at this process and figure out a little bit different ways so that you guys don't have to spend your Tuesday mornings listening to these kind of messes. Thank you.
When you talk process, what do you mean?
Well,
Is it our zoning process?
Well, the zoning process is not simple, but it's not simple for anyone, Madam Mayor. I would suggest that there's got to be a better way, especially on the neighborhood side, on your citizen side, that they can be brought up to speed before it becomes a he said, she said. Some of the proposals in this application were bordered on cartoonish. I mean, you know, in all honesty, for months the application was using the backyards of neighbors as part of the buffers. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but so I'm trying to get an idea of when you say process, I'm wondering if part of our process needs to be fixed.
Inclusion and communication. I mean, we've got to, on behalf of those of us that live in the development community, and more importantly today, those of us that are citizens and taxpayers and homeowners, we have to figure out I would urge you, we have to figure out a better way to do this so that we can not have these kind of instances happen in the future. There's got to be a better way.
How many neighborhood meetings did you have?
Ma'am?
How many neighborhood meetings did you have?
Madam Mayor, I've been involved in development for 40 years.
That's not what I asked,
know, but
because I want to make sure they follow the rules.
Yeah, I will tell you that these neighborhood groups have purposefully not hired professional staff. They're not going out to get an attorney. What I picked up from the dozens and dozens of meetings that they had in the neighborhood to try to get ready to have the conversations with applicants, I would bet that I would bet it borders on thousands, not hundreds of hours that the neighbors have spent in consultation. It's kind of hard to get 1,200 or 1,500 folks that don't have a singular infrastructure together to get a composite, coordinated response.
You speak like the legislature you were.
Well,
I'm trying to get a straight answer. How many neighborhood meetings did the applicant have?
I think 4 or 5. I can't remember 4. We have a timeline. We have the notes, and I'll be glad to share it with staff. And it's been a very robust process on our side. But I was speaking third person, Mayor. You guys have so much development going on. If any of them are like this one, I would beseech you to find a better way, because this has been very, very tumultuous for a lot of folks. And but for our counselor Counselor Buffkin spent months making sure both sides were at the table. But for his interjection, we wouldn't be here today, because this would have been old history. And this project is an amazing project. Everybody knows we need senior housing. It's no question. Everybody knows we need higher density. Nobody's arguing with that, at least on the neighbor side. But sometimes you just can't get something this big in a space this available. So that's what I would argue from a layperson's standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Madam Mayor, Council, good afternoon. Matthew Isley, 1920 Stannard Trail in Raleigh. Have lived in Inman Park for 16 years. Thank you for taking time to discuss this case today. I think there are 2 main problems with this case. One is the project. The other is the process. The problem is not the development company. Sing is a well-run company. I've personally grown fond of Mr. Graywall through this process, so we bear no animosity toward them or what they like to do. We do think this is the wrong place. This site is on lead mine in an area that's forever been entirely residential. It's unlike, for example, the Creedmoor Road case you're dealing with now, where you've got commercial on both sides of a 4-lane divided state highway. I think that Singh wouldn't be here talking about this proposal but for an obscure change in the future land use map that was made in 2013, which suddenly redesignated this area from low density residential to mixed office and residential. We missed it, to be quite candid. We didn't realize that it happened. At the time, if you remember, everybody was wondering, how has my particular property been rezoned under this redraft of the comp plan? And so we didn't appreciate that this change had occurred or what it might mean for us. But I think that has had a significant effect in distorting the view of what really fits properly on this site. And I would like to note that just the year before, when the council approved the rezoning for Overture Crabtree, your staff said this project fits where it's proposed on the west side of lead mine because it's within the Crabtree Growth Center where we want dense development to occur, but that Lead Mine Road forms a logical boundary between dense urban development and less dense residential development. And it's there for a reason, because lead mine is on a ridge. You can't cross it safely. So we suggested it would be best to continue that policy of observing the distinct difference between west and east of lead mine. However, I also want to say from the start, we have said we will support a significant upzoning of this property. This is not a NIMBY group. This is not a Save the Trees and the Owls group. We've suggested more than tripling the zoning density to allow for townhouses, garden apartments, something that would make for a more reasonable transition, we believe, between single-family residential to the east and north and south, and the commercial urban development to the west across lead mine. The other problem, though, has been the process. And we've had 4 meetings. We've had 1 meeting in person, which occurred about a month ago. And we could have met outdoors at any time over the last 8 months under the COVID rules. That didn't happen. What did happen was repeatedly changes were dropped on us at the 11th and a half hour before you or the planning commission were scheduled to consider the case. And that put neighbors at a disadvantage. As Prior said, we don't have an army of planners and engineers and architects. We didn't hire a lawyer. We're representing ourselves as homeowners and taxpayers and citizens. It's been very frustrating and frankly disappointing to have had to deal with the last minute changes in the proposal, and then we're in almost every case, bear in mind, after our deadline to submit a proposal for the review of the planning commission or the council. So I've watched the city council for a long time, about a quarter century. I've not seen a case that, in my opinion, has been handled as poorly as this one has by advocates of the applicant. So I hope that's something you'll be able to address as we go forward. And at the end of the day, let's hope we can get a redevelopment here that fits the site, that helps Raleigh grow and provides housing, but without threatening the single-family neighborhoods around it. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions of the applicant? I have one more question. Yes, no?
Go for it.
So my question is whether the applicant would consider any more conditions.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We are open to considering additional conditions. I think the discussion, though, today makes it clear why that's been a challenge for us and why some of these conditions have come forward towards the last minute. I can see that from the neighbor's perspective, but I think from our perspective, each of those changes has been in furtherance of a request. So we'll get, and I respect the fact that they are not in the development industry and it's sometimes difficult for them to draft their own conditions. So we'll get something like, we're worried about screening the parking deck. And so what we have to do when we get that concern is we have to write a condition and we have to submit it to the staff, your trained professionals, to say, we'll accept that from a legal perspective, or that duplicates code and we can't accept that. And that's a process that goes back and forth. But what is responded to and submitted is something that goes to the heart of the concern. And so we're happy to consider those additional conditions and look forward to meeting with this group to determine specifically what will not be too much. At this point in time, the reduction in the case has resulted in traffic generation that is 8 less trips in the morning and only 9 more in the afternoon. It is hard for me to imagine then, and that's compared to the by right situation. That's according to our traffic engineers. So if this rezoning were to be denied or somehow go away, by right, that traffic would be there whether we're approved or not. By right is I believe it's our it would be 8 less trips in the morning and only 9 more in the afternoon. So all of those concerns about the circulation and things would exist whether our zoning is here or not. And ironically, by us reducing the density, as we heard throughout this process, it also reduces the likelihood that a signal will be warranted. We cannot control whether DOT will warrant a signal at Charles Drive. We cannot control when and if that will happen. It depends on the background traffic and what comes along at what times. My understanding is we all we can say is, this is what our traffic study says, this is what DOT reviews, and mind you, a traffic study was not required with this. We did it anyway, and we resulted in what we believe is one of the lowest density, most kind of innocuous neighbors that you can imagine. Assisted living that barely generates traffic over what the by right scenario is. And the same is true with respect to the concerns raised on Fillcrest. We don't control that county road. And my understanding, with talking with planning staff and your transportation staff, who have been wonderful throughout this entire process, because there's been many questions, and there's been even disagreement within the city staff on how to measure height, what the result would be of this offered condition. And my understanding of their advice back to us was that because Fillcrest is not controlled by the city, that's not something that we can offer to improve. All we can do is improve what our property that's adjacent to Fillcrest Drive would be, and we would do that. We'd be required to do that at site plan. And that, as my understanding, would include an increased, a dedication of additional right-of-way if we need it, and then building sidewalks and street trees and gutters as required by the code. So all of that is required by the code anyway. That's true whether it's by right or not, but you're not going to get that improvement to the rest of Fillcrest that has been in that condition since many of those folks, I'm sure, have been in the area. And I understand those concerns, but none of that is going to happen as a result of any zoning case or any by right situation until control over Fillcrest is obtained by the city. And so we are absolutely willing to continue to listen to the requests that have been made. Unfortunately, because most of the requests and the reductions and the significant changes to this case have been made on the things that we do control, the things that remain, the things that after all of those concessions have been given are the things that are often out of our control. And so we'll evaluate and take a closer look about what is within our control, what else we can do to satisfy some of these concerns. But I want to stress that so much has been done so far in this case, and I appreciate Mr. Guard acknowledging it's a much different case than we began. So we will absolutely take that into account, and we'll put our heads together and reach out to the neighbors again and see if there's something else that is less intense, even though the comprehensive plan in 2013 supports the exact type of development that we're offering here. So we appreciate the suggestion, and we're happy to take it up.
Would you be willing to host another neighborhood meeting, perhaps outside, so everybody is talking at the same time? Is that something that this committee would entertain? Additional questions, another neighborhood meeting? Councilmember Cox?
In my view, the fundamental problem is exactly what the neighbors have raised, is that the growth center is on the other side of the street. It's on the west side, Crabtree Valley Growth Center. And the developer really wants to put something on the east side that is just, it's too big, it's too tall, it's too dense, and really does not conform with the comprehensive plan and is not compatible with the neighborhood. So unless there's a fundamental change, sure, we can have more neighborhood meetings and we can talk about this, but I don't really see it going anywhere. So if this were to come for a vote, I want to be clear that I would vote for denial.
Well, we're not here today to vote on that. So, Councilor Buffkin.
Oh, well, I'll say more conversation's always a good thing. I guess I expected the conversation to happen here, and, I saw one of the benefits of being in committee to have a more interactive discussion.
Which is what I tried to do today. Yeah. Help facilitate that.
Whereas the 8 minutes for each side that we do in front of council really doesn't allow for that.
Right.
For our part, we're happy to host additional meetings to the extent I didn't answer the question. We are happy to do that.
Councilor Fort?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful for the applicant and the community to have some more conversations going forward.
Okay, so the direction then from the committee is hold another meeting with the neighborhood, at least one more. Do it in person, now that we can, and consider additional conditions. I have one other question for you. The stoplight that was mentioned, have we had any conversations with NCDOT on that? Has staff had any conversations about that?
I might need to call Ramey Kemp up here to answer that question. I just want to make sure I'm being accurate. And absolutely, we will schedule those in person. The majority of the time that we had this case ongoing was during COVID restrictions, where there were many people that weren't comfortable meeting in person, and I'm happy that we are now able to do that. So Caroline with Ramey Kemp can address the NCDOT question.
One other thing, I know the applicant and everyone's aware of the condition deadline, so I just want to make sure everybody keeps that in mind. Right.
When is the condition deadline?
July 1st, is that correct? Mm-hmm.
Are you referring to a stoplight condition at Charles Drive?
Have we had any conversations with NCDOT about the potential for a stoplight? I have written down at Charles Drive. That's what I heard.
We, in our study, identified that the stoplight condition, we do typically, when an intersection is operating at a failing level of service, we do consider signalization there. And there are certain warrants that NCDOT has, and obviously it would need to be an NCDOT maintained signal. And unfortunately, along Charles Drive in this development, the traffic is primarily residential in nature, which typically only generates two peak hour, 2 times of the day that it really needs a traffic signal. That's in the morning and in the afternoon. And NCDOT typically does not want a traffic signal installed that's going to stop traffic throughout the entire day when it's only necessarily needed for 2 times throughout the day. So their warrants typically, they're looking for it to be met for 8 sustained hours throughout the day. So we did take a look at if it would meet those 2 peak hour warrants, and unfortunately it does not meet those 2 peak hour warrants. There are obviously other reasons to consider a traffic signal, but that's as far as our conversations go with NCDOT, is that based on this, based on the traffic projections, it's not expected to meet those warrants, and so NCDOT would prefer not to have a traffic signal that is going to disrupt the through traffic throughout the day when it's not necessary.
Okay. Councilmember Buffkin.
So a question. Oh, go ahead.
Wait a minute. Councilmember Buffkin.
So am I
Prior,
correct?
please.
Charles Drive
I'll
would,
call you up. Okay. Thank you.
Charles Drive
Councilmember
would
Buffkin.
align with the Lead Mine Road access to the site. Is that right?
Correct.
And are you aware that there's an effort to put a stoplight in at Inman Park and Sugar Bush?
Yes, we are aware, and that one, it does technically meet those peak hour warrants, and I believe it was identified in the staff report that this development, depending on the amount of traffic we're adding to it, and obviously with all of these reductions, we're adding less and less, but it was identified in the staff report to monitor that intersection for signalization.
Okay.
And that's how our traffic studies would, we obviously are trying to project the future traffic of the proposed development. And so whenever we recommend signalization, it's typically to monitor that intersection to see when it'll meet those NCDOT warrants.
Do you know how long the effort to put a stoplight at Sugar Bush and Inman and Lead Mine Drive has been going on?
I do not know how long that effort has been going on.
Do you know what the holdup is?
I do not know what the holdup is.
Maybe that's something you could look into.
Okay.
As we continue the conversation. That could be helpful. Councilmember Cox had.
Yes, I've seen a lot of reports about accidents in the area, and I know that some of the warrants take a look at accidents, and I was wondering what have been the conclusions from that?
Yes. Sorry, I had to print everything off. Let me just pull up our accident report. So the primary number of accidents located along this area, along Lead Mine, are rear-end collisions, which is common in a congested area. We did find, sadly, there was one injury, or one serious injury, and that is always sad to see that. However, we did not see a pattern of dangerous accidents in the area, and I believe I know that in the, we studied data for the past 5 years, and there were no fatal collisions along the corridor that we studied, and the recommendation was that this development isn't going to increase the traffic enough to really need to mitigate any issues along here, as it is primarily rear-end collisions due to just the existing congestion along lead mine.
What is the warrant condition for accidents? As I understand it, if there is a certain number of fatalities or if there's a certain number of other accidents, then the warrant is met. Has the warrant been met?
So it is a little more complicated than that. Whenever there's a fatal collision, the NCDOT, I believe they have 60 days to investigate the intersection and determine if there are any safety improvements that could be made at the intersection, and that can that is not necessarily always signalization. It could be restricting the site access. It could be installing certain signs or reducing the speed limit. But since our accident report was showing that there were no fatal, and I know you have to draw the line somewhere, but there were no fatal accidents in the area in our study, and we weren't seeing a pattern of serious accidents, which is why we didn't make any recommendations to improve the safety. And DOT did review, and so did the city, the report, and they agreed with our findings.
How many accidents were there in the 5-year period?
I have it broken down into multiple intersections. So the intersections that we studied, Glenwood Avenue and Lead Mine Road, Lead Mine and North Hills Drive, Lead Mine and Fillcrest, Lead Mine and Charles, Lead Mine and Inman Park, and I believe Fillcrest is a hot topic. And obviously these are all accidents that were reported. That's the only way we can collect the data. In that 5-year period at Lead Mine and Fillcrest Drive, there were only 2 accidents. Lead Mine and Inman Park, there were 13 accidents. And then obviously Lead Mine and Blue Ridge, there were 384 accidents. Lead Mine and North Hills, 66. In Lead Mine and Charles, there were 9 total.
And what about Glenwood?
What?
Lead Mine and Glenwood?
Lead Mine and Glenwood, there were 384.
384. Okay, I thought you said Blue.
So that's the
Blue Ridge.
yeah, that's the primary location of those accidents. But of those 384, 212 were rear end.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Gibson?
Madam Mayor, I was going to give those numbers that she just gave to the council. We've in the corridor more than 400 accidents in this particular area, and it's not the engineer's fault. It is a rising blind curve, and it's an acceleration point in this part of Fillcrest and Sugarbush. So it's not a area that you want to make a left turn in if you're entering. As to the situation with the stoplight, I believe that the request for the Sugarbush lead mine stoplight has been in for 11 years. It's only been in the last year that it has made the priority list, but it's so far down the priority list, it is not on DOT's radar to do. To my knowledge, there is no, in this development will impair the Charles Drive lead mine, which there is no stoplight study done there that I'm aware of. But so it is as the parent who has had to see their daughter cut out of a wreck, it's not a place that you want to add any more traffic to.
Thank you. Okay, so we will then ask, as we directed earlier, for a neighborhood meeting, and then conditions July 1st submitted, and then we'll see what you come up with. And thank you to continuing to work together. Anything else?
I have a question for staff. Is there any process to for the city to obtain control of Fillcrest Drive, excuse me? I mean, short of annexation of all the parcels around it, does this kind of thing come up?
Councilmember Bumpkin, I'm not in position to say definitively respond to that question, but it's certainly something that post this meeting we can look into. It's one of the items I've actually noted to do some investigation on our end just to explore that question.
Okay, thanks.
That's an interesting suggestion. Thank you.
I was just going to confirm that given the July 1 deadline, that would obviously be before the committee would potentially meet next, which usually we don't meet in July anyways. But so you guys are probably reporting this out with no action.
No, I want to continue discussion at the
Okay,
table.
so they'll have to turn them in, but we'll keep it in committee and you guys will discuss it
This
again next.
allows for a much more robust discussion. So, okay, if there's no further comment, consider this adjourned. And potentially, I will talk to my colleagues about a meeting in July if we feel, a committee meeting in July if we feel that's warranted. Okay? All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.